Okay, in this tutorial we are going to discuss few constructs of the object-oriented programming. The first one is inheritance. Inheritance basically inherits the state and the behavior from other classes. Overriding is overwriting the state or the behavior in the subclass. Polymorphism, as the name specifies, taking many different forms. Let's take an example and understand these concepts. So we have a class called person, and it has two attributes or two states called first name and the last name. It also has the behavior of printing that particular person. We have a subclass called professor, and professor also has the behavior of print. The professor is a person. Professor is also a person. In this case, professor inherits the state from person, which is first name and last name. So when we create an object of professor, we have access to the first name and last name. We don't have to create it again. The professor here is called the child class, and person is called the parent class, and we also refer to this as the subclass, and this one as the superclass. Many different names. Okay, what is the advantage of doing this? Once we create the person, we can have any number of the subclasses for the person. For example, we have a student. Student is a person, so let's add a student here. So there we go, we added a student, and student has the first name, last name, and they also have the graduation year and the GPA. GPA is nothing but grade point average, which is used in United States. So here is the code. The person class has the first name and the last name, and it has a constructor, and it takes two parameters, first name, last name, and creates the person object. And it has the behavior, which is a method called print. All it does is prints the first name and the last name. And we have the professor object class professor, which extends the person. That's how Java denotes extension, saying that professor is also a person. And we have the constructor here, which just calls the super first name, last name. Super has a special meaning in Java. Super means the parent class. In this case, super means the person, because person is our parent class. And it's also creating a method called print. So basically the signature of this method is same as the print method in person. So that means it's overwriting the behavior in person. All it does is it prints professor details, and it calls super.print. Super, as we know, is the person, which is our base class. So super.print, when it calls, it goes and then prints the first name and last name. We have a test method, test class, to test this whole thing. All it does is it creates a professor called knowitall equals new professor Peter knowitall, and it goes ahead and then calls the print method. Let's go ahead and run it. When we run it, it says professor details Peter knowitall. What's happening here is it calls the print method of the knowitall. Let's go to the professor, and here it says professor details. It printed the first line here, and next it calls the super.print. It goes to the professor and prints first name and the last name. So this is good. Let's see what happens if we remove this method. What will happen? When we call the print, it goes to the professor. There is no print method. It goes to the person and then calls this print method. Peter knowitall. So professor is inheriting all the print method also. So We don't want that. We want to override it. We want to override the behavior of the person. We want to hide it. And then when it comes here, it calls this, and then this in turn calls the person. So that's about overriding. Let's look at the student class, which is another example for the inheritance. Student extends the person, and we have added two additional properties, which is graduation and GPA. And we have a similar thing here which constructs the student, and it calls initially super first name and last name, which initializes the first name last name in the super class, which is the person. The print method is interesting again. It prints the student details, then super.print, and it prints the base class properties, and then it prints the properties that were added in this class. Let's see how we use this method. We have a test inheritance class. All it does is it creates a new student, Sam Walton, graduating in 2012 with a grade point average currently is 3.8. So we say sam.print. As we know, it prints the, if you go to the student here, it prints the student details and the first name and last name from the superclass, and then the graduation year and GPA. This is inheritance. So let's take a look at the polymorphism. Let's go back to the graphic for a second. In person, we have a method called print. This is overridden in both student as well as professor. So here we go. The class, it creates two students and a professor. It goes through the loop and it calls the person.print. When it calls the person.print on the student, Java automatically knows that it's the student. It calls the print method of the student, and so let's go ahead and execute it and see the output here. It first comes to the student here and then prints Sam Walton. It is printing the student details. It sees again in the next thing, it sees the student, it prints Bill Gates. And when it goes to the next iteration in the loop, it prints the professor detail, because it knows that the next object is professor. It automatically calls the print method of the professor. So that's basically the polymorphism. Polymorphism is taking different behaving differently depending on the object. These two things, inheritance and polymorphism, are very powerful constructs.